Picture a farm wife in 1925. She is walking down a dirt road into town with a basket over her arm. The basket is lined with a clean cloth, and underneath the cloth, packed in straw, are 3 or 4 dozen eggs. She walks into the general store. The shopkeeper takes the eggs, weighs them, and writes a number in his ledger. She buys some sugar, some thread, a tin of baking powder. She tucks what's left of her credit into a tobacco tin in her apron pocket. That tin in that apron is the only money in the entire household that is actually hers. It's not the household expense money her husband hands her on a Friday night. It's not the housekeeping money. This is hers, the coins from her eggs. Egg money.
I ain't afraid of the dark, 'cause once you let the light in, you won't see the beautiful stars shining down from afar. No, I ain't afraid of the dark. I don't mind the rain.
For most of the modern era, the chicken yard was the wife's territory. The farm was men's work, with the big animals, the plowing, the heavy lifting. But the hens out the back, the few birds pecking around the yard near the house, those were the woman's responsibility. And there was a logic to that. Chickens fit into the rhythm of domestic work in a way that bigger livestock didn't. You could feed them while you were already in the kitchen scraping plates. You could collect the eggs on the way to the washing line. The flock was close enough to the house that you could keep an eye on small children and small chickens at the same time. It wasn't strenuous work, not in the way that farming in the fields could be strenuous. It didn't need a lot of strength. It didn't need expensive equipment. It just needed someone willing to be paying attention all day long, every day, year in and year out. Which is to say, it was a woman's work. You see this pattern repeating across centuries and across cultures. In medieval Europe, the cottages hens were tended by the wife. In colonial America, the chicken yard was the housewife's domain. In 19th century Britain, in Victorian farmhouses, in Australian and New Zealand colonial homes, the same arrangement over and over again. The men ran the farm, the women ran the chickens. And because chickens were considered minor, sort of beneath the notice of the men running the real farm, something quite interesting happened with the income. The eggs in most households belonged to the woman who tended the hens. Of course, this could vary a lot, depending on where you were and what era and what household, but there was a general pattern, and it shows up again and again in farming memoirs and oral histories and old agricultural bulletins. The chicken flock produced 2 things. It produced eggs and meat for the family table, which was just part of feeding the household, and it produced surplus, eggs and chickens that could be sold or traded. And that surplus, that small cash income, was very often the wife's. This wasn't usually a written rule. Nobody sat down and signed an agreement saying the egg money is hers. It was custom. It was the way things were done. The eggs were so closely tied to her work that the income from them was understood to flow back to her. In America, they called it egg money, or sometimes butter and egg money, because the same arrangement often applied to the dairy. The cow was usually the husband's animal, but the milking and the butter making was the wife's work, and the butter that got sold at market, that money was hers as well. Egg money and butter money, the wife's money.
I don't mind the rain, bring your life back, we can breathe again. When dealing with the pain, no, I don't mind the rain.
And what did egg money buy? Small things mostly, things that the household budget didn't stretch to. A length of fabric for a new dress, school books for the children, shoes when the children outgrew the last pair, a subscription to a women's magazine, Christmas presents, a bit of something nice for Sunday dinner. But sometimes egg money bought big things too. There are stories, plenty of them, of women who paid off the family mortgage with egg money, women who put children through college on egg money, women who survived widowhood on egg money, who kept the farm running and the family fed after their husbands died on the strength of a flock of laying hens. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about her mother's egg money. She wrote about how the eggs and the butter that her mother sold in town were what bought the small luxuries of farm life. The calico for new dresses, the sugar for special occasions, the things that made a hard life feel a little less hard. And the reason this mattered so much, the reason egg money was such an important thing, comes down to law. For most of the period we're talking about, married women legally couldn't own most of what they earned. In England, until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, anything a wife earned belonged to her husband. In the United States, similar laws were passed state by state through the late 1800s. In New Zealand, our own Married Women's Property Act came in 1884. Before those laws, a married woman's wages, her inheritance, her savings, the money from any work she did, all of it legally belonged to her husband. But egg money? Egg money was so small, so domestic, so tied up with the everyday running of the household that nobody much bothered to claim it. It slipped under the radar. It existed in this grey area where the law didn't really reach because the law was written for big economic transactions and the egg money was just a few coins in a tobacco tin. And so for centuries, in millions of households, egg money was the one form of independent income that married women could reliably hold on to. That's a much bigger deal than it sounds. By the early 1900s, something quite remarkable started happening with backyard chickens. The breeds had been improved. The mail-order hatchery industry had taken off, particularly in America. You could now order 100-day-old chicks through the post and have them delivered to your nearest railway station. The hatcheries were producing reliable laying breeds, Leghorns and Rhode Island Reds and Plymouth Rocks, that would lay 150 or even 200 eggs a year. And the hatcheries knew exactly who their customers were. If you go and look at the hatchery advertising from the 1910s and 20s and 30s, the marketing is overwhelmingly aimed at women. The ads in farm magazines, the pamphlets, the catalogues, they're full of images of farm wives in aprons collecting eggs, and the copy is all about how a small flock of good layers could give a woman an income of her own. There were entire books and magazines written for this audience. There was a magazine called The Farmer's Wife, published from the 1880s right through to 1939. And if you flip through its pages from the 1920s, you can see the chicken yard treated as the wife's department, alongside cooking and sewing and the home garden. Government agricultural bulletins in America and Britain and here in New Zealand were specifically addressed to the farm wife and her flock. And women responded in huge numbers. By the 1920s, in rural America, the income from women's poultry and dairy work was a really substantial chunk of how small family farms actually made money. Not just a sideline or pocket change, real money that the household relied on. Then the Great Depression hit.
That's the way it goes. Life will teach you what you need to know.
And egg money turned out to be the thing that kept a lot of families alive. There are oral histories from the American Midwest from the Dust Bowl years where women describe the egg basket as the only cash income the household had for years at a time. The men were out of work, the crops had failed, the bank had taken whatever it could take, and the chickens, those minor little birds that were beneath the notice of serious farming, were what put food on the table and kept the lights on. I think what the Depression really revealed, very suddenly and very brutally, was that the women's quiet sideline had actually been holding up a significant share of rural America the whole time. It just hadn't been visible until everything else collapsed and the eggs were all that was left. Same story in different forms across the English-speaking world. In Britain during the Depression, in Australia during the rural collapses of the 1930s, here in New Zealand during the same period, the pattern was the same. When everything else failed, the chicken yard kept going. And then came the wars. And as I've talked about in the Victory Chickens video, governments leaned even harder on backyard flocks to keep their populations fed. A lot of those backyard flocks were tended by women because the men were away fighting. Egg money, butter money, garden produce, women's economic contribution to the household and to the country during those years was absolutely enormous. By the end of the Second World War, you had this situation where across millions of homes in America, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, women had been running real, productive, income-generating little operations for decades, quietly, in aprons, out the back near the kitchen. And then it all stopped. I've talked about the post-war collapse of backyard chicken keeping in another video, the Victory Chickens episode, and I'd recommend going and watching that one if you haven't, because it tells the bigger structural story of how governments and industry dismantled backyard food production after 1945. But there's a piece of that story that doesn't get told as often, and it's worth telling here. When backyard chickens disappeared, so did egg money. Industrial egg production made eggs so cheap that the small cash flow from a backyard flock just stopped making sense. You couldn't compete with the supermarket price. The economic logic that had supported women's poultry keeping for centuries collapsed in the space of about a decade. And the same thing was happening with butter. Industrial dairying meant that the small farm dairy, the few cows and the home butter making also stopped being economically viable. Butter money went the same way as egg money. Now, this happened against a much bigger backdrop, which is the post-war push to put women back into the home as full-time housewives. The men were home from the war. The men needed jobs, and the cultural pressure was enormous for women to step back out of the workforce and take up their proper role as homemakers. But homemakers who didn't earn anything. In the space of about a generation, women in the developed world went from having lots of small income streams, egg money, butter money, garden produce, sewing piecework, farm work, to having essentially none of that. The household ran on the man's wage. The woman's economic contribution was reframed as unpaid domestic labour. And egg money, that quiet little tradition that had persisted for centuries, just evaporated. Of course, plenty of women did still keep chickens after the war. Plenty of farms still had a flock. But the cultural and economic significance of the women's chicken yard as a real source of independent income, that was gone within about 20 years of the war ending. By the 1970s, when feminism was talking about women's economic independence, almost nobody was talking about egg money anymore. It had been forgotten. It had become this quaint old thing that Grandma used to do. And that's kind of sad, because egg money wasn't just income. It was a form of agency that millions of women had quietly held for centuries in the cracks of a legal and social system that mostly didn't allow them to hold anything. It was small, but it was real. And when it disappeared, something real disappeared with it.
Getting old don't bother me, 'cause with eyes that's been through life, it's so much easier to see who I am and who I wanna be. Don't getting old.
I do want to say something about where we sit now in 2026, with backyard chickens being kept by more people than at any point since the war. And almost none of those people are doing it for the money. I made a whole video about this, and the conclusion was pretty clear. A backyard flock is not a viable income stream in 2026. The economics just don't work out, not at the scale most of us are operating at. So what is it then? What are all of us actually doing with our backyard flocks if it's not an income? I think it's something that's quite hard to name. It's partly food quality, partly food security, partly the pleasure of keeping animals, partly a kind of resistance to the industrial food system. All of those things. But I also think that we are picking up a thread that was nearly cut. The flock as a place where you make decisions and have authority and exercise care, and nobody else is in charge of how you do it. The pride in food you produced yourself, the quiet competence of running a small, productive system out the back of your house. That tradition is much, much older than the brief 20th century interruption when it almost disappeared. We are not doing something new. We are doing something very old. It's interesting to me that for centuries this was specifically women's work and women's quiet income and women's authority. And while plenty of men keep chickens today, and that's awesome, there is still something here that connects modern keepers to a tradition that was, for most of its history, a woman's tradition. Whether you're a woman picking that thread back up or a man who has come into something that Grandma used to do, the thread itself is the same. We are all the inheritors of it. The money part of it isn't really there anymore, at least not in a meaningful way, but the agency part is still right there. The quiet authority over your own little patch of productive land, the pride in a basket of eggs you produced yourself. And that, I think, is worth knowing about. Most of the women who lived through the egg money era are gone now. The last of them were old by the time I was a child, and the world they grew up in is almost completely vanished. But somewhere in your family tree, if you go back far enough, there's almost certainly a woman who walked to town with a basket of eggs over her arm. A woman who kept a few coins in a tobacco tin in her apron. A woman who fed her children, paid her debts, and made her household possible on the strength of a few good laying hens. When you walk out to your coop in the morning and lift the lid on the nest box and find the eggs your hens have left for you, you are doing something that women in your family have done for generations. Most of them you never knew. Most of them never wrote anything down. Their names are mostly forgotten, but the work they did and the small independence they carved out for themselves, with that work, that's part of what we inherited. So the next time you collect your eggs, think of them. That's egg money.
Getting old don't bother me, 'cause with eyes that's been through life, it's so much easier to see who I am and who I wanna be. No, getting old don't bother me. Truth can be a bitter pill, but it'll do you right and set you free.